Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Notice where you are right now. Check what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're here to listen to this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that need to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a young man who got into a white sedan outside his home in Sydney's West one August evening in 2005 and was never seen again. A case linked to Sydney's underworld. A massive police investigation involving excavations, creek searches, and murder charges. A family still waiting to bury their son nearly 2 decades later. This is the story of Cengiz Sirach, Auburn, New South Wales. It's a suburb in Sydney's inner west, about 16 kilometers from the city center. In 2005, Auburn was a diverse, multicultural area, home to large Turkish, Lebanese, Chinese, and Korean communities. It was working class, busy, the kind of place where families had lived for generations alongside newer immigrants building their lives in Australia. Auburn also had a reputation. Parts of Sydney's western suburbs in the mid-2000s were known territories for organized crime. Drug trafficking, illegal gambling, protection rackets, all operated in the shadows of these communities. The police knew it. The residents knew it. Most people kept their heads down and lived their lives, but the underworld was there, always present. Cengiz Sirach was born in 1981. He was 24 years old in the winter of 2005. Those who knew him called him by various names, including Chris Martin, an anglicized alias he sometimes used. He was of Turkish background, part of Auburn's significant Turkish-Australian community. Cengiz lived with his family in Auburn. He was known to police, which in the language of law enforcement means he had a criminal record or associations with criminal activity. The exact nature of his involvement with Sydney's underworld has never been fully disclosed publicly, but investigators later described him as being on the periphery of organized crime. Whether Cengiz was deeply involved in criminal enterprises or simply knew people who were, whether he owed money or knew too much about something he shouldn't have, these are questions that remain partly unanswered. What is known is that in the world he moved in, disappearances happened. Deaths were collected violently. Witnesses were silenced. People who caused problems for the wrong people simply vanished. In early August 2005, Cengiz Sirach was living his life in Auburn. By all accounts, nothing seemed particularly unusual in the days leading up to August 2nd. He was going about his business, seeing friends and associates, doing whatever it was he did. Tuesday, August 2nd, 2005, was a winter evening in Sydney. The days were short, darkness coming early. At approximately 6:30 p.m., Cengiz left his family home in Auburn. Witnesses saw him get into a white 4-door sedan that had pulled up outside the house. The vehicle was unremarkable, the kind of car that wouldn't draw attention. Cengiz got in and the car drove away. That was the last confirmed sighting of Cengiz Sirach. When Cengiz didn't return home that night, his family wasn't immediately alarmed. He was 24 years old, an adult who came and went as he pleased. Perhaps he was staying with friends. Perhaps he'd be back in the morning. But the morning came and Cengiz didn't. Tuesday became Wednesday, then Thursday, then Friday. By Saturday, August 6th, for days after Cengiz was last seen, his family knew something was seriously wrong. Cengiz might have been involved in activities they didn't approve of, might have kept company they worried about, but he stayed in contact with his family. This silence was out of character. On August 6th, 2005, Cengiz Sirach's family reported him missing to New South Wales police. The missing person report was taken seriously from the start. When someone known to police, someone with connections to Sydney's criminal underworld, suddenly vanishes, investigators don't assume they've just taken an unannounced vacation. Detectives from Auburn Local Area Command began investigating immediately. They interviewed family members, trying to establish Cengiz's movements in the days before his disappearance. Had he seemed worried? Had he mentioned any problems? Had he indicated he might be going somewhere? The family couldn't provide much useful information. Cengiz had seemed normal. He hadn't mentioned any travel plans. He hadn't seemed particularly anxious or afraid. Investigators then turned to Sengiz's associates, the people he spent time with, the people who might know what he'd been involved in. This was more challenging. People on the fringes of organized crime don't generally cooperate enthusiastically with police. Interviews yielded little concrete information, though the detectives sensed an undercurrent of knowledge being withheld. The white sedan Sengiz had been seen getting into became a focus. Police appealed publicly for information about the vehicle. What make and model was it? Who was driving? Where had it come from and where had it gone? Despite the appeal, no one came forward with information that identified the vehicle or its occupants. In the days and weeks following Sengiz's disappearance, police conducted searches of areas in Auburn and surrounding suburbs. They searched along Duck Creek, a waterway that runs through Auburn. They checked known criminal haunts, abandoned buildings, anywhere a body might be concealed. They found nothing. By late August 2005, the investigation had reached a frustrating impasse. Sengiz Sarak had vanished, almost certainly the victim of foul play, but without a body, without witnesses willing to talk, without physical evidence, there was only so far detectives could take the investigation. The case went into the files as an unsolved missing person case, suspected homicide. But it didn't go away. In the years following Sengiz's disappearance, his case periodically received renewed attention. Missing person cases, particularly those involving suspected murder, are never officially closed in New South Wales. They remain open, waiting for new information, new witnesses, new technology that might crack them open. In 2012, 7 years after Sengiz vanished, New South Wales police established Strike Force Salacia specifically to investigate his disappearance. The strike force brought together detectives from Auburn and specialists in homicide investigation, giving the case fresh eyes and renewed resources. Strike Force Salacia began by re-examining everything from the original investigation. They re-interviewed witnesses, looked for connections that might have been missed in 2005, used updated investigative techniques to analyze the evidence. One aspect that received particular attention was the possibility that Sengiz's body had been buried or concealed somewhere in Sydney's western suburbs. Organized crime figures in Sydney had a history of making bodies disappear. Some were disposed of in bushland. Some ended up in waterways. Some were buried under concrete or in locations that wouldn't be searched. Detectives began hearing rumors, information from informants, whispers from the underworld. There were suggestions that Sengiz's body had been buried under a house in Marylands, a suburb not far from Auburn, specifically a house on Excelsior Street. This lead was taken seriously. Investigators looked into the history of the property. The house had been built in 2005, the same year Sengiz disappeared. It had been built by two brothers, Talal Kanj and Atef Kanj, and sold by them in 2007. The timing was significant. If someone had wanted to dispose of a body permanently, burying it under the foundation of a house being constructed would be an effective method. Once the concrete was poured, the house built, a normal family living there, no one would think to look. In April 2012, Strike Force Salacia obtained warrants to search the Excelsior Street property. The current owners, who'd bought the house in good faith and had no connection to Sengiz's disappearance, were relocated temporarily while forensic teams moved in. The investigation at the property was extensive. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan beneath the surface of the backyard, looking for anomalies that might indicate disturbed earth or buried objects. The radar found something, an abnormality beneath the dirt surface of the backyard. An excavation was ordered. Forensic teams carefully dug in the location identified by the radar. As they went deeper, they uncovered items. And then they found a bone. A small bone, too damaged and degraded to identify immediately as human or animal. The bone was sent to forensic laboratories for analysis. The entire property was processed as a potential crime scene. Soil samples were taken. More digging was conducted. But despite the intensive search, no complete remains were found. The single bone found in the backyard couldn't definitively be identified as belonging to Sengiz Sarak. It might have been human. It might have been animal. The forensic analysis was inconclusive. Even without finding Sengiz's body at the Marylands property, Strike Force Salatia's investigation was making progress. The renewed focus on the case was yielding results, particularly in terms of witnesses who were now willing to talk about what they knew or suspected. On April 3, 2012, police made their first arrest. A 29-year-old man from Auburn was arrested and charged with concealing a serious indictable offense in relation to Sengiz's disappearance. This charge essentially meant police believed this man had helped hide evidence of Sengiz's murder, even if he wasn't necessarily the killer himself. The same day, detectives questioned a second man, a 43-year-old who was already in custody at Silverwater Correctional Complex for unrelated offenses. This man was also believed to have information about what happened to Sengiz. The investigation intensified. Strike Force Salatia executed multiple search warrants across Sydney's western suburbs. They interviewed dozens more people. They released computer-generated images of 3 additional men they wanted to speak with regarding Sengiz's disappearance. The investigation also returned to Duck Creek in Auburn, the waterway that had been searched shortly after Sengiz vanished in 2005. This time, the search was larger, more systematic. Over 100 officers, including divers, dog squad members, and state emergency service volunteers, combed sections of the creek. The search of Duck Creek yielded results. Officers found bones in the creek. Several of them. They were collected and sent for forensic analysis to determine if they were human and, if so, if they could be connected to Sengiz Serac. The bone analysis took time. Some of the bones found in Duck Creek were determined to be human, but they were fragmentary, degraded by years in water and exposure to elements. Definitive identification through DNA was challenging. Then, on April 23, 2012, Strike Force Salatia made a more significant arrest. A 29-year-old man was arrested at his home in Chittaway Bay on the New South Wales Central Coast. This man was charged with the murder of Sengiz Serac. Finally, after nearly 7 years, someone had been charged with Sengiz's killing. The man charged was not publicly named in initial media reports due to legal restrictions, but he was described as having connections to Sydney's western suburbs and to the criminal networks that operated there. He was refused bail and appeared at Wyong local court. The case against him would take time to build to prepare for trial. The prosecution's challenge would be significant. Proving a murder case without a body, without a crime scene, without clear physical evidence. Prosecuting a murder without a body is one of the most challenging endeavors in criminal law. In most murder cases, the body provides crucial evidence. It shows cause of death, time of death, location of death. It can yield DNA evidence, trace evidence, proof that the victim was killed rather than having simply disappeared voluntarily. Without a body, prosecutors must rely on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and inference. They must prove beyond reasonable doubt that the missing person is dead, that they were murdered, and that the defendant is the one who killed them. In Sengiz Serac's case, the prosecution would need to establish several things. First, that Sengiz was dead rather than missing voluntarily. This wasn't particularly difficult given the circumstances. A 24-year-old man doesn't vanish completely for 7 years, never accessing bank accounts, never contacting family, unless something terrible has happened to him. Second, they'd need to establish that Sengiz had been murdered rather than dying accidentally. The evidence of him getting into a white sedan, the involvement of multiple people in concealing what happened to him, the connections to organized crime, all pointed toward murder rather than accident. Third, and most challenging, they'd need to prove the defendant had killed Sengiz or been directly involved in his killing. This required witness testimony, ideally from people who'd been present or who'd been told by the defendant what he'd done. In Sydney's underworld, getting people to testify against someone charged with murder is difficult. Witnesses fear retaliation. They fear being labeled as informants. They face pressure from criminal associates to remain silent. As the case progressed through the court system, the prosecution's case was being assembled. Witnesses were interviewed and re-interviewed. Some were offered deals in exchange for testimony. Others were threatened with charges themselves if they continued to withhold information. But building a case strong enough to convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt was proving difficult. The defendant, represented by experienced criminal defense attorneys, was maintaining his innocence. His lawyers would argue that without a body, without definitive proof that Cengiz was even dead, let alone murdered, the case was based on speculation and unreliable witness testimony. As months became years, the case moved slowly through the legal system. Pre-trial hearings were held. Evidence was challenged. Witnesses were assessed for credibility. And Cengiz Sarak's family waited. They'd been waiting since 2005. Now they were waiting again, hoping that this arrest, these charges, would finally bring some form of justice and closure. The murder charge against the man arrested in April 2012 was a significant development in Cengiz Sarak's case. But it wasn't the resolution everyone hoped for. As the prosecution prepared its case for trial, problems emerged. Key witnesses who'd initially agreed to testify were becoming reluctant. Some were recanting statements they'd given to police. Others were simply refusing to appear in court, despite subpoenas. Without cooperative witnesses, the prosecution's case weakened significantly. The circumstantial evidence and the forensic findings weren't enough on their own to meet the high standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt required for a murder conviction. In the end, the murder charge didn't proceed to trial. The case collapsed before it reached a jury. The exact reasons for this aren't fully public, but it's understood that the prosecution determined they couldn't prove the case with the evidence available. The man who'd been charged with Cengiz's murder was released. He'd been granted conditional bail at some point during the proceedings, and with the charges not proceeding, he walked away from the case. For Cengiz's family, this was devastating. The hope that had been raised by the arrest and charges, the belief that finally someone would be held accountable, was crushed. Once again, they were left without answers, without justice, without closure. Strike Force Salacia didn't shut down, however. The investigation remained active, technically. Detectives continued to pursue leads as they arose. But without the breakthrough that could definitively identify what happened to Cengiz or where his body was located, the case had reached another impasse. The bones found in Duck Creek and at the Maryland's property remained unidentified. Forensic testing hadn't been able to conclusively link them to Cengiz. They might have been his remains. They might not have been. The degradation and fragmentation made certainty impossible. The white sedan Cengiz had been seen getting into on August 2, 2005, was never definitively identified. Despite appeals and investigations, the vehicle's make, model, ownership, and occupants remained unknown. The people who knew what happened to Cengiz, who were present when he was killed, who helped dispose of his body, remained silent. Whether through fear, loyalty, or self-interest, they kept their secrets. Today, nearly 20 years after Cengiz Sarak got into a white sedan outside his Auburn home and vanished, his case remains officially unsolved. He is still listed as a missing person, though New South Wales police believe he was murdered shortly after his disappearance. His family has never been able to bury him, never been able to grieve properly with a funeral and a gravesite. Instead, they live in the limbo that families of the disappeared inhabit, where hope and certainty can't coexist, where every phone call might be news, every anniversary is marked by absence. The investigation into Cengiz's disappearance technically remains open. Strike Force Salacia is no longer actively pursuing the case with dedicated resources, but the file exists. If new evidence emerges, if a witness comes forward, if remains are discovered that can be identified as Cengiz's, the investigation can be reactivated. Over the years, there have been occasional developments. In 2020, Cengiz's case was mentioned in media reports about families dealing with missing loved ones, highlighting the particular cruelty of not having a body to bury. His family spoke about their continuing anguish, their need to know what happened, their hope that someone with information would finally speak. The case represents a frustrating reality of organized crime investigations. People know what happened. Multiple individuals were almost certainly involved in or aware of Cengiz's murder and the disposal of his body. But getting those people to talk, to testify, to provide the evidence needed for a conviction remains nearly impossible. The code of silence in Sydney's underworld is powerful. Informants are dealt with harshly. Families of those who talk can be targeted. The risks of cooperating with police are significant and real. For investigators, cases like Sengiz's are exercises in frustration. They know what probably happened. They have strong suspicions about who was involved. But suspicion isn't proof, and beliefs don't lead to convictions. Some of the people who were suspects or persons of interest in 2012 have since died or been imprisoned for other crimes. Time is erasing the possibility of justice as witnesses age and die, as memories fade, as the case recedes further into history. Cengiz Sarak was 24 years old when he disappeared. He would be in his mid-40s now if he's still alive, though no one believes he is. The evidence, the circumstances, the passage of nearly 20 years without any contact, all point to one conclusion. Cengiz died in August 2005, almost certainly murdered, his body concealed somewhere in Sydney's western suburbs or disposed of in a way that ensured it would never be found. His family deserves better. They deserve to know with certainty what happened to their son, their brother. They deserve to be able to bury him, to mourn properly, to have a place to visit and remember him. Cengiz's involvement in Sydney's underworld, whatever form that took, doesn't make his life less valuable or his murder less serious. He was a human being with family who loved him. Whatever he'd done, whatever mistakes he'd made, he didn't deserve to be killed and disappeared. Someone knows where Cengiz Sarak is. Someone knows who killed him and why. Multiple people were involved in concealing what happened. They've carried these secrets for nearly 20 years. Circumstances change. Loyalties shift. People who were afraid to talk in 2005 or 2012 might feel differently now. Some of those involved might themselves be dead or imprisoned, releasing others from obligations of silence. If you have any information about Cengiz Sarak's disappearance and murder, New South Wales Police continue to accept tips. Crime Stoppers allows anonymous reporting. After 20 years, the risk of coming forward may be less than it once was. But the need for answers remains as urgent as ever. Cengiz Sarak's body is somewhere. In a creek under a building in bushland somewhere in Sydney. He deserves to be found. His family deserves to bring him home. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Cengiz's story. Keep his case in the public consciousness. Sometimes that continued attention is what finally brings forward the witness or the information that solves a case. Thank you for listening tonight and for remembering Cengiz Sarak, the young man who got into a white sedan one August evening and never came home. Story 2. Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a young woman who sat on a bar stool at the edge of a dance floor one summer night in 1996 and was never seen alive again. A case that would remain a mystery for 13 years until a shocking discovery on a motorway slip road. A murder that remains unsolved nearly 3 decades later. This is the story of Melanie Hall. Bath, Somerset, England. It's one of Britain's most beautiful cities, famous for its Georgian architecture, Roman baths, and honey-colored stone buildings. In the mid-1990s, Bath was a university town, a tourist destination, a place where history and modern life coexisted comfortably. Melanie Joan Hall was born on August 20th, 1970. She grew up in Bradford-on-Avon, a small town in Wiltshire, just a few miles from Bath. Her parents, Stephen and Pat Hall, were hardworking people who valued education and wanted the best for their children. Stephen would go on to serve as chairman of Bath City Football Club, a well-known figure in the local community. Melanie had a sister, Dominique, and the two girls grew up in a loving, stable family environment. Melanie was bright, ambitious, determined. From a young age, she had dreams of attending university, of making something of herself. In the early 1990s, Melanie enrolled at the University of Bath, one of Britain's top universities. She studied psychology and sociology, subjects that fascinated her, that spoke to her interest in understanding people and society. University was everything Melanie had hoped it would be. She thrived academically, made friends, enjoyed the independence of student life. In 1995, Melanie graduated with her degree. For her mother, Pat, seeing Melanie walk across that stage to receive her diploma was a moment of immense pride. Melanie had worked so hard for this, had dreamed of it for years. It was, Pat said later, a cherished dream fulfilled. After graduation, Melanie got a job as a clerical officer at Bath's Royal United Hospital. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady employment, a way to use her organizational skills while she figured out her next steps. Her mother, Pat, also worked at the same hospital, and they would sometimes see each other during the workday. At 25 years old in 1996, Melanie was living a comfortable life. She had her degree, her job, her family nearby. She had a boyfriend, Philip Carlbaum, though the relationship had its ups and downs as young relationships often do. Melanie was described by those who knew her as friendly, attractive, with distinctive blonde hair that made her stand out. She enjoyed going out with friends, dancing, socializing. She was, in every way, a typical young woman in her mid-20s, living her life, making plans for the future. Saturday, June 8, 1996, was significant for reasons beyond what would happen that night. It was the opening day of Euro '96, the European Football Championship being held in England. The tournament had generated enormous excitement across the country. That evening, England was playing Switzerland at Wembley Stadium. The match would end in a 1-1 draw. For Melanie and her friends, it was simply a Saturday night, a chance to go out, to dance, to have fun. They made plans to go to Cadillac's nightclub in Bath City Center, a popular venue on Walcott Street. On the evening of June 8, 1996, Melanie's mother, Pat, dropped her off at Philip Carlbaum's home. From there, Melanie, Philip, and another couple headed into Bath City Center to Cadillac's nightclub. Cadillac's was the kind of nightclub that attracted a mixed crowd, young professionals, students, locals out for a good time. It had a dance floor, a bar, the usual atmosphere of loud music and crowded spaces that characterize nightclubs everywhere. The group arrived at Cadillac's and settled in for the evening. They had drinks, they danced, they enjoyed themselves. It was a normal Saturday night out, unremarkable in every way. But as the evening progressed, tensions developed between Melanie and Philip. The exact nature of their argument has never been fully disclosed, but witnesses reported that Philip became upset when he saw Melanie dancing with another man. Whether this was innocent dancing or something that crossed a line in their relationship, Philip took it badly. At some point during the evening, upset and angry, Philip left the nightclub. He went home, leaving Melanie at Cadillac's with the other couple they'd come with. After Philip left, Melanie continued her evening. She had friends there, she was enjoying the music and the atmosphere. There was no reason to cut her night short just because she'd had an argument with her boyfriend. At approximately 1:10 a.m. in the early hours of Sunday, June 9th, Melanie was last seen by witnesses she knew. She was sitting on a stool at the edge of the dance floor. She was alone at that moment, perhaps watching the dancers, perhaps deciding whether to join them, perhaps just taking a break. This is the last confirmed sighting of Melanie Hall alive. What happened next is unknown. At some point after 1:10 a.m., Melanie left Cadillac's nightclub. Whether she left alone or with someone, whether she was planning to walk home or catch a taxi, whether she left willingly or under duress, no one knows for certain. There was one unconfirmed sighting that may have been significant. A witness reported seeing a woman who matched Melanie's description arguing with a man in Old Orchard, a street near the nightclub entrance, between 1:45 and 2 a.m. The witness couldn't be certain it was Melanie. The lighting was poor, the distance too great for a definitive identification. But the timing and location made investigators take the sighting seriously. If it was Melanie, who was the man she was arguing with? Was it someone from the nightclub who'd followed her out? Was it Philip, returned to find her? Was it a stranger who'd approached her on the street? Police would never be able to confirm whether the woman in that argument was Melanie Hall. But the possibility haunted the investigation. After that possible sighting around 2 a.m., Melanie Hall vanished. No confirmed sightings, No phone calls, no contact with family or friends. She simply disappeared into the Bath night. Sunday, June 9th passed. Melanie didn't return home. This wasn't immediately alarming. She was 25 years old. Perhaps she'd stayed with friends. Perhaps she and Philip had made up and she'd spent the night at his place. Monday came. Still no Melanie. But Monday was a work day. Melanie had a job at the Royal United Hospital. She was responsible, reliable. She would turn up for work. Tuesday, June 11th. Melanie was scheduled to work. Her mother, Pat, who worked at the same hospital, expected to see her daughter that day. But Melanie didn't show up for work. Pat immediately knew something was wrong. Melanie didn't miss work without calling. She didn't just not show up. This was completely out of character. Pat called her husband Stephen. Stephen called their other daughter Dominique. The family began trying to reach Melanie, calling her flat, checking with friends, trying to piece together where she might be. No one had seen her since Saturday night at Cadillac's. No one had heard from her. Her belongings from Saturday night, her distinctive pale blue silk dress, her black suede mule shoes, her cream jacket, her black satchel-type handbag with her bank card and checkbook, all had vanished with her. On June 11th, 1996, 2 days after she was last seen, Melanie Hall's parents reported her missing to Avon and Somerset police. The investigation began immediately. Detectives interviewed Philip Carlbaum. Where had he been after leaving the nightclub? Had he seen Melanie after he left Cadillac's? What had their argument been about? Philip told them about the argument, about seeing Melanie dancing with another man, about leaving upset. He said he'd gone home and hadn't seen Melanie again. His alibi for the rest of the night was checked. Nothing suggested he was lying. The other couple who'd been at Cadillac's with Melanie and Philip were interviewed. They confirmed the argument, confirmed seeing Melanie sitting on the bar stool around 1:10 a.m., confirmed they'd assumed she would make her own way home. Detectives began the difficult task of trying to trace Melanie's movements after 1:10 a.m. They interviewed staff at Cadillac's. They appealed for anyone who'd been at the nightclub that night to come forward. They checked with taxi companies to see if any driver had picked up a woman matching Melanie's description. An e-fit was created based on witness descriptions of a man who'd been seen talking to a woman matching Melanie's description inside Cadillac's. The man was described as white, in his mid to late 20s, 5 feet 10 inches tall, of medium build, with dark brown hair, dark brown eyes, bushy eyebrows, and clean-shaven. He'd been wearing black trousers, black shoes, and a brown silk shirt, possibly a gold hoop earring in his right ear and a flashy gold watch. This e-fit became a crucial part of the investigation. Who was this man? What was his connection to Melanie? Had he been the last person to see her alive? Despite appeals and extensive investigation, the man in the e-fit was never identified. As days became weeks, and weeks became months, the investigation into Melanie's disappearance continued, but with decreasing hope of finding her alive. On November 5th, 1996, 5 months after Melanie vanished, the BBC program Crime Watch UK featured her case. The program included a reconstruction of Melanie's last known movements, showing an actress portraying her at Cadillac's nightclub, sitting on the bar stool, leaving the club. The Crime Watch appeal generated dozens of calls from the public. Tips came in, possible sightings were reported, theories were offered. Each lead was investigated, but none brought Melanie home. As time passed, the grim reality set in for Melanie's family and for the police. The chances of finding Melanie alive diminished with each passing day. The investigation shifted from a missing person case to a suspected murder inquiry, though without a body, proving murder was impossible. Years passed. The investigation never officially closed, but active work on the case decreased. Detectives moved on to other cases. The files on Melanie Hall gathered dust. For Stephen and Pat Hall, the not knowing was torture. They couldn't grieve properly because they had no confirmation their daughter was dead. They couldn't bury her because there was no body. They couldn't move on because there were no answers. They marked each birthday Melanie missed, each Christmas without her, each anniversary of the night she disappeared. The years accumulated, but the pain never lessened. In 2004, 8 years after Melanie vanished, she was declared legally dead. This was necessary for practical and legal reasons, for settling her affairs, for acknowledging what everyone already believed. Melanie Hall had died in June 1996, but the declaration of death didn't provide closure. It didn't answer the questions of how she died, who killed her, where her body was. Stephen and Pat continued to fight for their daughter. They gave interviews to keep the case in the public eye. They cooperated with periodic police reviews of the case. They refused to let Melanie be forgotten. Then, in October 2009, 13 years after Melanie disappeared, a discovery on a motorway slip road would finally provide some answers while raising entirely new questions. October 5, 2009. A workman was clearing vegetation along the northbound slip road at junction 14 of the M5 motorway near Thornbury, South Gloucestershire. In the undergrowth near the roadside, he found a black plastic bag. Something about it seemed wrong. The bag was old, weathered, partially concealed. He opened it. Inside was something that would immediately change the workman's life and reignite one of Britain's most troubling missing person cases. The bag contained human remains. Skeletal remains wrapped in rope. Not complete remains, but bones. Enough to be unmistakably human. The police were called immediately. The area was secured. Forensic teams arrived. The remains were carefully removed and transported for examination. The location was significant for several reasons. Junction 14 of the M5 is approximately 25 miles from Bath. The slip road is an isolated location, not a place where pedestrians would normally walk. Anyone depositing something there would need a vehicle. The remains had been wrapped carefully, tied with rope using distinctive knots. 7 knots in total, 3 used to join rope segments and 4 additional ones. The knots suggested someone with knowledge of rope work, possibly someone with sailing experience or a similar background. Forensic examination of the remains and testing began immediately. Dental records were used to make an identification. The remains were those of Melanie Hall. After 13 years of not knowing, after 13 years of hoping against hope that somehow Melanie might be alive somewhere, the Hall family finally had confirmation. Their daughter was dead. She had been murdered shortly after disappearing in 1996, and her remains had been concealed by a motorway for 13 years. The discovery brought some closure but opened new lines of investigation. How had Melanie's remains ended up there? Who had killed her and transported her body to that location? What had happened to her between leaving Cadillac's nightclub around 1:10 a.m. and her death? The forensic examination revealed little about how Melanie had died. After 13 years exposed to the elements, the remains were too degraded to show clear cause of death. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, no bullet holes or fractures that would indicate how she was killed. But the rope, the knots, the black plastic bag, the remote location all indicated planning. Whoever had killed Melanie had made efforts to conceal her body where it wouldn't be easily found. The fact that the remains were found at all was almost accidental. If the vegetation clearance hadn't happened, if the workmen had been clearing a different section of roadside, Melanie might never have been discovered. The discovery of Melanie's remains transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a murder inquiry with physical evidence. A new operation, codenamed Operation Denmark, was established. Avon and Somerset police devoted significant resources to finally solving Melanie's murder. The forensic examination of the remains and the items found with them yielded crucial evidence. DNA was recovered from the rope that had been used to wrap the remains. This DNA didn't match Melanie. It belonged to her killer. Additionally, 3 keys to a Ford vehicle, possibly a Transit, Fiesta, or Escort, were found near the body. These keys became a focus of investigation. Police worked with Ford to try to identify which vehicle these keys belonged to. In 2010, police arrested a 38-year-old man from Bath on suspicion of Melanie's murder. He was questioned and released on bail, but ultimately, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. He remained a person of interest, but suspicion isn't proof. Over the following years, multiple arrests were made. Men were questioned, DNA samples were taken, alibis were checked. By 2019, 11 arrests had been made during the investigation into Melanie's murder, but no one was ever charged. Each arrest ended the same way: insufficient evidence to proceed to prosecution. The investigation looked at several possible suspects from outside the immediate circle. John Cannon, a convicted murderer and serial rapist who was the prime suspect in the disappearance of estate agent Susie Lampla in 1986, was questioned. But Cannon had been in prison at the time of Melanie's disappearance, making his involvement impossible despite some witnesses claiming they'd seen him. Police also investigated possible connections to the Batman rapist, a serial sex attacker who'd operated in Bath and left a baseball cap with a Batman logo at one crime scene. But no definitive link to Melanie's case could be established. In 2013, police searched a property in Bath's Round Hill Park area after arresting a 44-year-old man. The search yielded no evidence linking him to Melanie's murder, and he was released without charge. Each arrest, each search, each lead that didn't pan out was devastating for the Hall family. They'd been given hope repeatedly, only to have it dashed when charges weren't filed. In 2016, a 45-year-old man was arrested following retrieval of additional DNA evidence from where Melanie's remains were discovered. Again, he was released on bail, and again, no charges were brought. In October 2019, police revealed they'd obtained a partial DNA profile from the rope that had been wrapped around the bag containing Melanie's remains. This was more detailed than previous DNA analysis and offered renewed hope. The DNA profile could potentially be compared to familial DNA in databases, a technique that had solved other cold cases. If a relative of Melanie's killer was in a DNA database, the familial connection might point investigators toward the right suspect. Stephen and Pat Hall, now in their 70s, reinstated a £50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction. They gave interviews emphasizing that time was running out. They were getting older. They needed answers before it was too late. The case was featured in a 90-minute documentary on Channel 5 in September 2023, The Body in the Bag: The Murder of Melanie Hall. The documentary included interviews with Melanie's family and with Superintendent James Riccio, the senior investigating officer. Riccio stated publicly that police believed Melanie knew her killer. The crime wasn't random. It was personal, or at least involved someone who'd made contact with Melanie at Cadillac's or shortly after she left. The e-fit from 1996 of the man seen talking to a woman matching Melanie's description in the nightclub remained a focus. Police still wanted to identify this man, nearly 3 decades later. Police also appealed to anyone who might have helped dispose of Melanie's body but wasn't involved in the murder itself. They emphasized that coming forward, even as an accessory after the fact, was better than remaining silent. The appeals generated tips, but as of now, no breakthrough. Melanie's murder remains unsolved. The investigation continues, technically. The case file is open. If new evidence emerges, if the DNA finally matches someone, if a witness comes forward with information, the case can move forward. But nearly 3 decades have passed. People who were in their 20s in 1996 are now in their 50s. Memories fade. Witnesses die. Time erodes the possibility of justice. Conclusion: the woman on the barstool, 58:00-60:00. Melanie Hall was 25 years old when she was murdered. She would be 54 now if she'd been allowed to live. She would have had nearly 3 more decades of life, experiences, relationships, achievements. Instead, her life ended shortly after she left Cadillac's nightclub in the early hours of June 9, 1996. Someone killed her, wrapped her remains in rope, placed them in a black plastic bag, and left them by a motorway where they wouldn't be found for 13 years. Her parents, Stephen and Pat, have spent nearly 3 decades seeking justice for their daughter. They've endured the agony of not knowing, the discovery of her remains, the repeated hope and disappointment of arrests that led nowhere. They're elderly now, time running out for them to see Melanie's killer brought to justice. Someone knows what happened to Melanie Hall. Someone killed her. Someone transported her body. Someone tied those distinctive knots in that rope. Someone has carried this secret for nearly 30 years. If you have any information about Melanie Hall's murder, Avon and Somerset police continue to accept tips. You can contact them directly or use Crime Stoppers anonymously. If you were at Cadillac's nightclub on the night of June 8, 1996, if you recognize the man in the E-Fit, if you saw something suspicious near Junction 14 of the M5 in June 1996, if you know someone whose behavior changed around that time, that information could finally solve this case. Melanie deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. The person who killed her deserves to be held accountable for what they did. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Melanie's story. Keep her case alive. Keep the pressure on for justice. Thank you for listening tonight and for remembering Melanie Hall, the young woman who sat on a bar stool at the edge of a dance floor and never came home. Story 3. Before we begin tonight, take a moment. Notice where you are right now. Check what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about two 17-year-old girls who drove away from a high school in rural South Dakota one May night in 1971 and vanished completely. A mystery that would haunt two families for 42 years until a discovery in a creek changed everything. This is the story of Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller. Vermilion, South Dakota. In 1971, it was a small town of about 9,000 people, situated in the southeastern corner of the state. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where high school sports were the social center, where life moved at the gentle pace of the Great Plains. Pamela Mae Jackson and Cheryl Ann Miller were both 17 years old in the spring of 1971. They were seniors at Vermilion High School, just weeks away from graduation. Both girls were popular, involved in school activities, excited about their futures. Pam Jackson was a vivacious girl with a bright smile. She had plans after high school, dreams of what came next. She was dating David Lucan, a relationship that seemed serious to those who knew them. Cheryl Miller was Pam's best friend. The two girls were inseparable, always together, sharing the bond that teenage best friends have. Cheryl was also well-liked, known for her friendly nature and involvement in school life. May 1971 marked the end of an era for these girls. High school was ending. Adult life was beginning. The summer stretched ahead with all its possibilities. But first, there were the final weeks of senior year to enjoy. Friday, May 28, 1971, was a warm spring evening in Vermilion. There was a gathering planned, an end-of-year party at a gravel pit outside of town. These parties were common among Vermilion teenagers, informal gatherings where young people could socialize away from adult supervision. Pam and Cheryl planned to attend. Pam was driving her family's 1960 Studebaker Lark, a distinctive car that anyone in Vermilion would recognize. The plan was simple: drive to the party, have fun with friends, drive home. A normal Friday night for two teenage girls in small-town South Dakota. Around 10:30 p.m., Pam and Cheryl left a basketball game at Vermilion High School. They were heading to the party at the gravel pit. Several witnesses saw them leave in the Studebaker. That was the last time anyone saw Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller. When Pam and Cheryl didn't come home that night, their families weren't immediately alarmed. Teenage girls sometimes stayed out late. Perhaps they'd stayed at the party longer than planned. Perhaps they'd gone to a friend's house afterward. But Saturday morning came, and neither girl had returned. Neither had called. This was unusual enough to cause concern. By Saturday afternoon, the families were worried. Pam's boyfriend, David Lucan, was questioned. Had he seen the girls? Did he know where they might have gone? David said he'd been at the party at the gravel pit. He'd expected Pam to arrive, but she never showed up. He hadn't seen her or Cheryl that night. Other attendees at the party confirmed this. Pam and Cheryl had never arrived at the gathering. Whatever had happened to them had happened somewhere between the high school and the gravel pit. The route was straightforward. You'd leave Vermilion, drive south, take country roads to where the party was being held. It wasn't a complicated journey. There was no reason for two girls familiar with the area to get lost. On Sunday, May 30th, 1971, Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller were officially reported missing. A search was organized immediately. Volunteers from Vermilion and surrounding communities turned out to help look for the girls. Search parties walked fields and ditches along the route the girls would have taken. They checked abandoned buildings, looked in creeks and ponds, searched anywhere two girls or a car might be. They found nothing. No trace of Pam or Cheryl. No sign of the distinctive Studebaker lark. It was as if they'd driven into thin air. As days became weeks, the investigation intensified. Police interviewed everyone who'd been at the party, everyone who'd seen the girls that Friday night, everyone who might have information. Several theories emerged. Had the girls been in an accident, their car going off the road into water or down an embankment where it couldn't be seen? Had they been victims of foul play, abducted or murdered by someone? Had they run away together, seeking escape from small-town life? The runaway theory seemed implausible. Both girls were just weeks from graduation. Both had family they were close to. Both had plans for after high school. Running away made no sense. But without evidence, without a body, without even the car, investigators had little to work with. As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, the active search wound down. For the families of Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller, the years that followed were marked by uncertainty and grief. They couldn't bury their daughters because there were no bodies. They couldn't have closure because they didn't know what had happened. Both families maintained hope that someday, somehow, they'd get answers. Pam's mother kept her room as it had been, waiting for her to come home. Cheryl's family did the same. The not knowing was torture, but giving up hope seemed like a betrayal. Over the decades, the case periodically received renewed attention. In the 1980s, there was speculation that serial killer Robert Leroy Anderson might have been involved. Anderson had committed murders in South Dakota around the same era, but no evidence connected him to Pam and Cheryl's disappearance. In 2004, 33 years after the girls vanished, there was a development that seemed promising. David Lucan, Pam's boyfriend from 1971, was arrested on unrelated charges of rape and kidnapping. While in custody, he made statements that led investigators to believe he might know something about what happened to Pam and Cheryl. In 2007, Lucan was charged with murder in connection with the girls' disappearance. Prosecutors alleged that he'd killed them in 1971, though they acknowledged they had no bodies, no physical evidence, no crime scene. The case against Lucan was based largely on statements he'd allegedly made and circumstantial evidence from 1971. His lawyers argued the evidence was insufficient, that you couldn't convict someone of murder without proof the victims were even dead. In 2009, the murder charges against Lucan were dismissed. A judge ruled there simply wasn't enough evidence to proceed to trial. Without bodies, without physical proof of death, the case couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Lucan maintained he had nothing to do with the girls' disappearance. The dismissal of charges meant he'd never face trial for their deaths. For the families, this was devastating. They'd believed finally there might be justice, finally someone would be held accountable. Instead, they were back to uncertainty and unanswered questions. Then, in September 2013, 42 years after Pam and Cheryl vanished, a fisherman in Brule Creek made a discovery that would finally provide answers. September 23, 2013. A fisherman was in Brule Creek near the town of Elk Point, South Dakota, about 30 miles north of Vermilion. The creek had been running low due to drought conditions, exposing parts of the creek bed that were normally underwater. The fisherman noticed something unusual, what appeared to be a car, partially submerged and covered in decades of sediment and creek debris. He reported it to authorities. Union County Sheriff Dan Limoges responded to the scene. What they found was shocking and sad in equal measure. It was a 1960 Studebaker Lark, Pam Jackson's car. The vehicle had been in Brule Creek for over 4 decades. Mud and silt had covered it. Vegetation had grown over it. It had been invisible from the road, hidden in the creek bed, unnoticed by countless people who'd passed by over the years. Inside the car, investigators found human remains. 2 people. Based on the location and the vehicle, they knew immediately who these remains belonged to. but confirmation would require forensic analysis. The car and the remains were carefully extracted from the creek. The scene was processed meticulously. After 42 years, this was finally the break in the case that families and investigators had been hoping for. Forensic examination and DNA testing confirmed what everyone suspected. The remains were those of Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller. After more than 4 decades, the girls had been found. They'd been less than 30 miles from where they disappeared, in a creek that had been searched multiple times over the years, but where the car had remained hidden. The discovery of the car and the remains allowed investigators to finally reconstruct what happened on the night of May 28, 1971. Pam and Cheryl had left Vermilion High School around 10:30 p.m., heading toward the party at the gravel pit. At some point, they'd ended up on a rural road near Brule Creek. The evidence suggested they'd been traveling at highway speed when the car left the road. There were no skid marks, no evidence of braking. The car had gone off the road, down an embankment, and into Brule Creek. Whether Pam had been distracted, whether there'd been an animal in the road, whether the road conditions or darkness played a role, no one could say with certainty. But what was clear was that this had been an accident. The car had sunk quickly in the creek. Water would have rushed in. Pam and Cheryl, trapped inside, would have had little time to react or escape. They drowned in the car, together, just miles from the party they'd been heading to. The location where the car entered the creek was remote. The embankment was steep. The creek was deep enough that the car was completely submerged. In 1971, there would have been no witnesses. No one would have heard the splash. No one would have seen the car go in. Over the following days and weeks in 1971, as searchers looked for the girls, they'd passed within miles, perhaps even hundreds of yards, of where the car lay hidden. But Brule Creek had kept its secret. Silt and mud had gradually covered the vehicle. Vegetation grew over it. The creek flowed on, season after season, year after year, concealing the car and the 2 girls inside. The dismissal of murder charges against David Lucan in 2009 had been the correct decision. There had been no murder. Lucan had nothing to do with what happened to Pam and Cheryl. They died in a tragic accident, not at anyone's hands. The discovery brought mixed emotions to the families of Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller. After 42 years of not knowing, of hoping despite the odds, of imagining every possible scenario, they finally had answers. Pam and Cheryl were dead. They died the night they disappeared. There had been no suffering beyond those final moments in the car. There had been no abduction, no violence, no malicious intent. Just a terrible accident on a dark country road. For the families, there was relief in knowing. Relief that the girls hadn't suffered for long. Relief that they'd been together at the end. Relief that after decades of uncertainty, they could finally lay their daughters to rest properly. But there was also profound sadness. 42 years of waiting. 42 years of hoping they might walk through the door. 42 years of missed milestones, of birthdays and holidays marked by absence. Both families had aged considerably since 1971. Some family members who'd searched for the girls had passed away without ever knowing what happened. The mothers who'd kept their daughters' rooms unchanged had grown old waiting. Funerals were finally held. Pam and Cheryl were buried, their families able to visit graves, to have a place to mourn. The closure that had been denied for over 4 decades was finally achieved. The case raised questions about the original search efforts. How had the car been missed for so long? Why hadn't it been found in 1971 when searchers were actively looking? The answer was simple geography and circumstance. The location where the car went in was off the expected route to the gravel pit party. It wasn't an area that would have been prioritized in searches. The creek had quickly hidden the car. Without knowing exactly where to look, finding a submerged vehicle in miles of waterways was nearly impossible. It was only the 2013 drought, lowering water levels in Brule Creek, that finally revealed what had been hidden since 1971. Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller were 17 years old when they died. They never graduated from high school, never went to college or started careers, never married or had children. Their lives ended on a country road on a May night in 1971. For 42 years, their disappearance was one of South Dakota's most haunting mysteries. A story of two girls who vanished completely, leaving families in anguish and a community searching for answers. The truth, when it finally came, was simpler and sadder than many of the theories that had developed over decades. No murder, no conspiracy, just a tragic accident and a creek that kept its secret for over 4 decades. Pam and Cheryl are remembered in Vermilion as the girls who disappeared, the mystery that finally was solved. Their story serves as a reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change, how accidents can have consequences that echo through decades. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share the story of Pam and Cheryl. Remember them not just as a mystery, but as two 17-year-old girls with their whole lives ahead of them. Thank you for listening tonight.